Hey warriors, today's tutorial is on beating insulin. Insulin is actually a good hormone. It's useful for putting glucose from the bloodstream into the cell. When you eat nutrient, whether it's carbohydrates, fats, or proteins, it has to be digested. The first stop is the stomach, and depending on the balance of your macronutrients, you will have eventually the release of certain enzymes, liver and pancreas, to start the breakdown process, in addition to the hydrochloric acid that's in the stomach. The pancreas is this tiny gland that sits about right here, and it's important for releasing enzyme. It's also important for releasing insulin and glucagon. Both of those are like a push-pull hormone to either get glucose up or lower glucose down from the bloodstream. So they're very crucial. The problem I've seen the last 30 years is we've squeezed our way out of preparing whole foods and meals old-fashioned way. Doesn't matter which continent you're on, but every continent has its go-to meals and its flair, spices or certain flavors. But with food technology and its progress with science, the food industry has allowed people on one side of the earth to ship their product to the other side of the earth and not spoil. So definitely a major boon when it comes to storage of food. It also takes you away from the dynamic in the kitchen of the family chopping vegetables, kneading meat, making dough, and preparing the meal for the day. You can rationalize that because of the 50 to 60 hour work week, you have no time to do that, and that's fine. That's kind of like rationalizing, I'll buy a huge family-sized bag of popcorn instead of a tiny bag of popcorn, but inevitably you'll pay the price of that shortcut. So for the majority of people that I see, you're not type 1 diabetes, you're everything else. And the everything else category has really blossomed into several different stages. The bottom line is, on your way to getting to insulin dependence and insulin resistant and type 1 diabetes, you have to start somewhere. The medical industry is fantastic and the medicines out there are great, but they usually catch you right before you get into type 1 diabetes. Like young people that go to the emergency room for DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, sometimes that's the first warning sign, and it's a heavy warning sign that you have diabetes. But for the majority of the people on earth, especially with obesity or a BMI, body mass index greater than 25, you're already starting that journey. You guys who've seen me before, you have to understand that the reason I was pushing so hard and looking for hemoglobin A1C, or looking for fasting glucose levels, or looking for weight, size, elevated cholesterol. For those of you who've seen me in the clinic, you know that I push hard when it comes to fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C, insulin levels, sometimes oral glucose tolerance tests, even glucagon levels. I do all that because I like to have metrics that will help you get to that goal. The problem I see with a lot of my colleagues is that they're only stopping at the first 2 blood tests and then usually just waiting until it's declared that you're almost an insulin-dependent diabetic. I think there's a wide bandwidth between totally normal, no disease process, not even a hint of pre-anything, pre-diabetes, pre-hypertension, pre-cholesterol, and then being an insulin-dependent type 1 diabetic. The point I want to get across is with this video, you should be able to touch on that bandwidth, even if your doctor says you're healthy. So just with some basic definitions, there's something called insulin resistance, impaired glucose tolerance, and impaired fasting glucose. All these categories say that you're on your way to that direction. So if myself or my colleagues have labeled you with this, please start to enact and do something about it. Have a plan, even if it's daisy chain baby steps, so that you don't get to the end point here. So dovetailing into what I just described about eating nutrient, getting it into the stomach, having digestive enzymes, breaking that stuff down, turning it into essentially vomit so it can be absorbed. Science today has said that depending on the macronutrient dominance in the meal or in the vomit, proteins, fats, or carbohydrates, your body will react to that by sending a wave of a hormone. This is an old concept back in 2008, and we already had the inkling that people were moving into that direction. Usually when your body mass index is high, and it doesn't matter if you're big boned, you've always been that way, your whole family's that way, or you're muscular, there's going to be a time when your metabolic system taps out and says, okay, I give up, it's too much. No physician, no scientist, and no trainers can predict when it's gonna happen because everybody's a little different. There's so many variables and levers to pull that are involved with getting you that way that it's hard to predict, and you shouldn't be put into an algorithm. Now, if you're at death's door and you're presenting to the emergency room in a diabetic coma, there's an algorithm for saving you, but there is no algorithm this way. So what the medical community usually does is we rely on you guys to change your life. You have pre-diabetes or any of these things, be careful, lose weight, exercise, and I'll see you next year. That's inappropriate, and that usually makes people search for answers, and YouTube is the easiest access for answers unless you want to read all these boring texts. Some of the information on YouTube makes sense. Some of the information on YouTube doesn't make sense, but it's easy to follow. Some of the information on YouTube is just dangerous. That's why my job as a doctor also includes being a librarian, so I can help you assimilate the true facts and get the crap out of the way. When America started to become obese, at 1 in 4, 1 in 5 Americans, the CDC and the AMA tried to do a couple things to get people to recognize and reverse that, but it hasn't gone anywhere. In fact, in some parts of the United States, it's 1 in 2 Americans now are obese. So the nutritional doctrines that were given to doctors to suggest for patients hasn't really worked. I honestly don't like the term pre-diabetes because it gives you a false sense of security saying, I'm not there yet. I'll try to work on it and I'll see what happens by next year. But as you know, bills get in the way, kids getting sick get in the way, COVID gets in the way, and pre-diabetes isn't a priority. Then comes the last minute Hail Mary pass 1 to 2 months before your wellness exam of chunking down the weight, going into starvation, doing 1,000 hours of cardio. And I sympathize with my patients because there are some doctors that still fat shame. I remember talking to an endocrinologist in 2012 about somebody that had morbid obesity and is only taking about 1,000 calories a day. His answer was, she's probably lying to me about her total caloric intake per day. The basic formula of calories in and calories out doesn't really fly because there's too many variables that are involved with digestion, with mood, with sleep, with exercise. In fact, the old school technique of just calculating somebody's basal metabolic rate with some internet calculator and saying, stick to this and you will lose weight is so outdated. And that's the beauty of science. As it evolves, it gives us better opportunities to tackle the very complex problems that we see in society. I do believe I have some videos on prediabetes and insulin resistance, which I'll put in the links down below, so check them out. And by the way, if you have found that your doctor's not helping you or your registered dietitian is shaming you, please get to me on my Herbal 411 webpage and become a patient of mine. Let's talk about a couple concepts that people are gravitating to move the needle back this way. Jason Fung is a Canadian physician who made intermittent fasting very popular. It essentially introduces the idea of having a fasting window and a feasting window. And the concept is fair. When you starve yourself and hold off from nutrient, the body will go into a last-minute scramble to look for other sources instead of sugar and glucose. Most of us, because of COVID, have not been able to exercise in the gyms, have been able to just sit in your chair, order food, have it at the front door and eat it, in addition to the stress of possibly dying. All that stuff has put on extra weight. And fat, wherever you keep it, is supposed to be an extra fuel source for just in case. So even if you lower carbs and remove sugars from your diet, get rid of alcohol, the body, when it goes through that starvation signal, which is a stress or fight or flight response, it forgets that it stored all that fat. You'll just get bigger and bigger and you'll have nasty cravings because the body just triggers this hunting reflex. And it does not help when the food industry is on a vendetta to fool you into thinking what you're eating is healthy. Ultimately, it's so confusing, and that's why my job as a librarian is not easy. I like the effects of intermittent fasting. I think it does work to move the needle, but it does set up the potential for a bad relationship to food. And technically, if you starve too much, you'll get into that biggest loser problem. The biggest loser phenomenon is when you see people drop massive amounts of weight, exercise the hell out of their lives, which I don't think is sustainable. But when you hold that line of starvation too long, the body is ingenious and it learns to shut down the metabolic rate. So essentially, when your metabolism drops to starvation level, it becomes very efficient at extracting ATP out of what little you're eating. So that tiny meal and all that cardio you're doing will actually make you gain weight. That's why I like the way Walter Longo came up with pulsing your fasting attempts. When you do a 5-day fast, you drop down for 5 days, once a month for 3 months, and maybe thereafter, to shut down the body and contract its systems. But you pop back up into normalcy, healthy normalcy, after the 5th day. But during the refeed phase, which I call the 6th to the 16th day, your body doesn't recognize starvation, so it doesn't lower its metabolic rate. So that's the problem with metabolic adaptation. The body is just ingenious. So when you exercise your head off, whether it's resistance or cardio, and you drop your calories down to ungodly amounts, and you try to sleep as best as you can, you will lose weight, but then you'll plateau. And during the plateau, you can guarantee that the things that you were doing before won't serve you anymore because the body has reformulated its metabolism. And then comes the Keto Community, which is an army of individuals that have had some pretty good successes with following a well-formulated ketogenic diet. The information that's accumulating with Taubes, Finney, Volek, D'Agostino, Haller, it's great, but it needs time to be sold to a medical community. And I've only had one patient in my practice that was able to sustain it for about 1 to 2 years. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but you have to do a lot of planning. So who gets the adjustments, how fast do we move, how fast do we pull the triggers, depends on your risk factors. ASCVD stands for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and if your risk percentage is 7.5 to 10 or greater, we gotta move fast. For those of you who I've gently nudged the warning that we gotta do something soon because you're heading into this direction, I wanna present to you Starlings Curve of the pancreas. Starlings Curve of the pancreas is not a concept that all endocrinologists or primary care doctors accept, or maybe even know about. But in my old videos, I talked about the pancreas letting go of insulin from its beta cells, and there's only so many packets of insulin that it can let go of in a lifetime. Well, this curve goes up and it goes down. So as it goes up, you'll be able to respond to excessive amounts of glucose and carbohydrates. Eventually, when you keep on showering your bloodstream and pancreas with excessive carbohydrates, glucose, high fructose corn syrup, or alcohol, it'll burn out and it's going to say no more. And that's when you get into insulin resistance and you have to start doing injections. Everybody's peak is a little different because it's so variable, but we can't predict when it's going to happen, but I believe it will happen. If you buy into the concept and you accept the fact that there's only so much insulin to be secreted, you don't have to wait until you need the insulin. There's other medicines that are actually better out there than metformin and glyburide, which are very useful and entry level and covered by all insurances. Usually within 5 years, they burn out and you have to add a second drug. The other medicines that are out there that your insurance company will not cover unless your doctor goes through this gauntlet of pre-authorization that takes like 2 hours. The other medicines that are out there that your insurance company will not approve unless your doctor goes through this gauntlet of 2 hours of pre-authorization are SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 analogs. And I think they're great, but they are injectable. There is one that's being released that's oral, but definitely if the injectables don't get covered, the oral will not get covered unless you pay gobs of money. Which brings you right back to the metformins or the oral sulfonylureas, which I think are okay. Sometimes they also make you gain weight. So this whole concept is so frustrating, but the bottom line is that the United States is going into obesity. So if that continues to happen, then everybody will be on medicines of some sort. So somebody's making money off of these medicines and somebody's suffering, which is usually going to be you guys. I refuse to submit to the restrictions of crappy medicines or big box hospitals that follow algorithms to make sure that you have your stent or your insulin pump. And that's why the basic target of working on lean muscle, decreased body fat percentage, and just being youthful healthy is important. Being healthy in itself is a moving target, but I think it's still something that you can shoot for. You have to have the right team of coaches to at least formulate a map to get out of the pit and have a target. Hopefully all this information I've given you tells you that there is hope. And there is a way to get out of just being a prisoner of an insulin pump, but you're gonna have to jump for it. If you have any great endocrinologists in your area of the world that you've relied on, please put them in the comments down below and share this with people who are on the fence or a little frustrated and they're about to enter into this gauntlet. Don't forget to like it and subscribe because it helps the channel. I can put out more content. Never settle for being average. Always try to maximize on health, and I'll see you at the next video.